Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity. One thing that struck me over the last couple of days is, I guess, just how many of the challenges that we share in common with what you're experiencing here. And there's quite a bit of information on this slide, but one of the first points I just wanted to make was the challenge around population growth that we both are facing, and the challenges and the opportunities that growth presents. Just to give you a snapshot of where Perth and Western Australia has come from, where we are now and where we're going in a population sense, the growth has been very strong over the last 10 or 15 years. Perth alone has been growing at around about 50,000 people per year and currently sits at around 2.1 million population, with about 2.6 million in the state more broadly. To give you some sort of sense about where that has us, it's taken around about 190 years since European settlement to get to that point. Now looking forward, using the Australian Bureau of Statistics projections, those numbers at both a state and capital city level are expected to almost double, or potentially more than double, in the next 30 years. So 190 years to get to where we've got, more than doubling in the next 30. To around between 4.8 and 6.4 million in the state, 3.9 to 5.4 million in the capital. In an economy sense, gross state product has grown enormously over the last 10 years as well, by about 47%, taking us from about 158 billion to about 233 billion today. Western Australia's economy is very resource and mining focused. WA is the world's biggest iron ore producer and exporter, and Australia is set to overtake Qatar next year as the world's largest LNG exporter, of which WA produces more than half of that for Australia. So we're coming off the back of a major resources boom, a once-in-a-generation type of boom. We have an opportunity right now to catch our breath, but not for long. The worm is starting to turn upwards in the economy. The big push for WA is about diversifying the economy that we have, building off the back of our resources strengths, but also moving into other key areas of the economy as well. So the government's been in place for about 18 months now. Around the infrastructure space, they have a range of initiatives they're implementing in both the investment space and the policy space. Certainly, we believe that infrastructure is key to unlocking economic potential and to maintaining the quality of life that we enjoy. So a range of those measures are up there: establishing Infrastructure WA and a 20-year state infrastructure strategy that will go with that. I will touch on that a little more later on. A new whole-of-government policy to receive and assess market-led proposals from the private sector, also known as unsolicited bids. We are currently preparing an economic development strategy for the state, and the focus of that strategy is about both growing our economy and, importantly, diversifying our economy to take some of the boom and bust nature out of it. The EDS will be very important to the operation of Infrastructure WA. It will send a clear signal about where government sees the economy going, and it will ask Infrastructure WA for its advice about, in an infrastructure sense, what the priorities for investment will need to be if that vision is to be realised. In the investment space, government is investing around $20 billion over the next 4 years in all sorts of public infrastructure. In the transport space, which does seem to be a major issue here in New Zealand and particularly Auckland, so I'll just touch on that a little bit in my presentation. There is a mix of investment across road, public transport and active transport. The key part of this is a program known as MetroNet. It's a major rail expansion program for Perth. Stage 1 of MetroNet will consist of a range of different projects: 72 k's of new rail, taking the network from a 6-line network to an 8-line network with 2 new lines and 4 line extensions. Up to 18 new stations, a very strong focus on land use integration. This is not by any means just a transport initiative. 5,000 hectares of development opportunities around those stations. Removing level crossings on some of our older rail lines, procuring just under 250 new rail cars and an automatic train control system as well. Another initiative is known as Westport, which is planning for the future container port for Perth, which will be moving it from the inner harbour, where it currently sits in Fremantle, to a new outer harbour facility to the south of the city near Kwinana. We're also working with the Commonwealth Government and local governments around a city deal for Perth, which will provide a mix of funding and policy initiatives that we need to meet the growth challenges for the next 15 or 20 years. Just going to touch a little more on the MetroNet program. MetroNet is really the third major wave of rail investment in Perth over the last 30 or so years. Perth has certainly been a success story in terms of rail development over that time. We've moved from really a low point in the early 80s, where our patronage on the rail system had dropped to around just 6.5 million passengers a year. In the 90s, there was an electrification program, an expansion of the rail to the north. In the 2000s, there was a major expansion of the rail system to the south. And now in this third wave, there's a further expansion of the rail system to the north, south and east of the city. That investment has meant that patronage has grown by tenfold, taking it from that 6.5 million that I talked about in the early 80s to around about 65 million passengers a year today. And that accounts for just under half of the 150 million or so people who use public transport in Perth each year. So just to look at the program a little closer, some of the projects are already underway. The Forestfield Airport Link is currently being constructed. It consists of 8.5 kilometres of new rail built pretty well entirely in twin-bore tunnels. That will take us out to the airport and beyond to a new station at the foothills. That project is due to open in 2020, so it's well underway now. The next phase of the program will be to look at, to start construction on a further 2 projects. The Thornley-Coburn link will be the start of a circle line for Perth, which will provide an orbital rail service around the city, connecting with the radial lines that lead you back into the CBD. The Yanship rail extension will also be part of the investment that will get underway next year, and a further investment in the years following that. A part of MetroNet that is probably gets less attention and is certainly less sexy, but by no means any less important, is the automatic train control system, which is really about sweating the asset a lot better than it currently is. It will allow the network to increase its capacity by up to 150%, taking train headways from a peak gap of about 5 minutes per train service at the moment on any particular line to much closer running trains down to sort of headways of 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Just moving off MetroNet then, and I'll just touch on a little bit about the I-body that we are currently in the process of setting up in Western Australia called IWA, and I'm just going to play you a very quick video now that gives you an overview of what it's all about. So no doubt many of the issues canvassed in that will be very familiar and resonate too with many of you here, and I think certainly some of those elements have been picked up in various presentations over the last couple of days. But the drivers for change and why we're doing it, really for us, the focus of it is around economic growth and creating jobs. That is really a very, very key focus for us in Western Australia. What we know is that infrastructure does create jobs during the construction phase. Those jobs tend to be relatively short term. More importantly, though, it unlocks economic opportunities and job opportunities for the long term if the right projects are invested in at the right time. We want industry to invest, we want industry to create jobs, but in order for industry to do that, they need certainty so that they have the confidence to make that investment, and that is really what is at the heart of Infrastructure WA. That is what it's all about. That's what sits behind the election commitment in the Plan for Jobs, which is really what has given us a mandate to do this, as well as a more recent inquiry into a range of government programs and projects which made multiple recommendations calling for Infrastructure WA. We have a lack of a long-term infrastructure strategy in WA, which has held us back to some degree. We also have a highly constrained public funding environment, which makes the task of picking the right projects even more important. Like you, we have a siloed and piecemeal decision-making process across our agencies. There are a number of well-publicised projects that have suffered from fragile political consensus, both within terms of government's backflipping on major commitments they've made to infrastructure investments, and also between changes of government, where governments have cancelled major projects that the prior government had invested in and had underway. We have a lack of transparency and consultation and engagement at the moment. People wondering, well, how did these major decisions get made, and what was the basis for them? Difficulties in considering innovative solutions and ideas to the problems we face, things like user pays. Some of these things are off the table from a political sense. And issues experienced with infrastructure delivery as well, from business case development through to construction. So the roles and functions for Infrastructure WA, it will be established under legislation. We feel that is absolutely critical if it's going to have longevity and last more than a term of government. It will have an independent board with up to 10 members. That'll be a 50-50 split between senior public servants and non-government members, which again we feel is very important to have that mix, the best of both worlds. Part of that will include an independent chair who will be a prominent person. Its role will be essentially advisory to government, and the roles will include developing that 20-year infrastructure strategy, assessing business cases for government for major proposals which we pitched at projects above $100 million, high-risk projects below that threshold, or other projects that are called in, providing advice to government on alternative funding and financing options, coordinating the state's dealings with Infrastructure Australia, the Commonwealth body, who assess a number of our business cases for federal funding, which is very important to us, providing input to government's 5 to 10 year infrastructure program, which will also be the pipeline document that government will be required to publish annually, helping agencies with their sectoral plans, or in some cases developing those sectoral plans for them where IWA is requested to, and importantly improving that collaboration across government and with industry and the community. It won't be a procurement agency, it won't be a delivery agency. We feel it is important to keep those two functions separate, but equally that's not a problem that we had to address. Procurement and delivery is already something that's done through our Department of Finance and the Office of Strategic Projects that sits within there, which provides that centre of excellence across government. So in coming up with this model, we certainly looked globally. We looked at what other states were doing. We looked at what was happening nationally. That gives you a little bit of a summary up there, and I must apologise to Alan from Tasmania because I left his one off in putting this together. But what you can see there is there's a lot of similarities, there's some differences. I would stress that each model has responded to different issues and problems in that jurisdiction. I don't think there's really any right or wrong approach in that. But for us in Western Australia, what is key is really two arms to the organisation. The first is a strategic planning function. We need to have a credible long-term infrastructure plan. But the best made plans can sit on the shelf and just collect dust. So in addition to having that long-term plan, having a role in assessing business cases at the investment end of the spectrum, we also feel is just as important if we are going to rebuild the public confidence in the decisions that government makes around infrastructure investment. So we had a draft proposal that the Premier launched in February this year. That has received absolutely enormous support from industry. In the submissions process, there was not a single submission that made a negative comment about it. A number of submissions certainly put forward ideas on how it could be improved and strengthened further. But I think that the thing to note here is that it does take a courageous government to do this. For any politician, I think this is quite a scary thing to do. But I think we're not the first ones doing it. We have the benefit of being able to look at how these things have operated elsewhere, and the lived experience of these things in other jurisdictions has been far less scary than the thought of it, which should give us some reassurance. And just lastly, I guess, some key considerations and reflections and learnings that we've taken from it. Certainly a pragmatic approach is called for. It needs, the model that you come up with does need to target the problems that you're experiencing. Credibility is really key. I would actually say credibility both internally and with external stakeholders. This is where the independence part comes in. It's not independence as an end in itself, it's independence in order to have that credibility, particularly with your external stakeholders. I would add, I guess, a note of caution there, though, that the need for balance between independence to have the credibility, but also influence. And if you become too independent and alienated from government, you effectively become a think tank, which means that your ability to influence government's decision-making processes can be eroded. So finding that right balance between independence and influence is really key. The other thing that I can't stress enough is the culture and personalities of the people that are appointed, both the CEO and the chairperson as well as the board members. They can make the organisation either a success or not. I guess some other things that I'd share with you is take the time to get it right. Don't take forever, but take enough time to get it right. It's better to get the model right than to rush it through. What I'd say to people in the room here today as well is that industry support for this is absolutely critical. It is a courageous step for governments to make, and it's good to see that Infrastructure New Zealand support this. I would call on the other industry bodies in New Zealand to absolutely get behind it. It's going to take every one of you to make this the right model and get it over the line. So our journey on this in WA certainly continues. We now have approval from Cabinet to draft the legislation, which is just getting underway as we speak. We're hoping to introduce that bill into Parliament later this year, and subject to that process, to start operation of Infrastructure WA early in 2019. We have money now in the budget to enable that to happen. So fantastic to hear the announcement here today. I wish you all the best with it. We are very happy to continue to share learnings and experiences with you. Watch what you're doing with great interest. So thank you.